Welcome back to Square Off. State lawmakers had some major water issues to tackle in this year's legislative session. What did they get done? Is the cup half full or half empty? Let's talk about two major issues, starting with the question of whether suburban areas around Phoenix have enough water to grow. Joining me is Joanna Allhands of the Arizona Republic, azcentral.com. She writes opinions on all kinds of things, but especially water, and that's why you are here today. So let's talk about these two issues. Does Phoenix have enough water to grow? That's a big question. Governor Katie Hobbs made national headlines with what was incorrectly interpreted last year as a ban on growth. What could the legislature have done to deal with that?
Well, there was this huge package that people were talking about that came about, really it had been talked about for most of the session, but really kind of came toward the end. And the goal was to put a bunch of different pieces together that could help get some housing growth, which really has been the part that has been paused in places like Buckeye and Queen Creek, to get some of that going again. And
what in the end did get done?
Well, some of the bills that had been cobbled together into a giant bill then got split apart again and then passed. Some of those were signed into law, but the big mamma jamma, the big part of that was trying to figure out how can we then use some agricultural lands to then build houses on, and how do we do that in a way that's sustainable so we're not just messing up the aquifer, that actually could have some benefits for our groundwater that we use. And so that part wasn't quite ready and did get a veto.
And so will this change the narrative? Are there still those limits on growth?
There are in places. There aren't limits on growth in the major cities that you think of when you think of Metro Phoenix.
But Buckeye,
Queen Creek, those are kind of the two big areas, and Pinal County, of course, which has been under this moratorium, if you want to call it, for many, many years.
The other major issue, wells in rural areas are going dry because of over pumping. What were the plans to deal with that?
Well, that was a whole other effort and began at the very beginning of the session. People met and compromised and things fell apart, and then people came back together and more compromises happened. And in the end, there was a bill that came up at the very last day of the session and had things that people were kind of like really just scrambling, trying to say, wait, what was in this bill? What happened? And it actually very narrowly failed. So it actually almost could have gotten there. And I think that's probably the frustration, is that it was just so close. If we may have had just a little bit longer to work on it, I think we could have gotten there. We'll see.
Where does that leave folks in rural areas? No change at all?
Well, that doesn't change anything in existing law. So, I mean, technically they could go the routes that are currently in law to create some sorts of regulation there. A lot of people say that these just don't work for rural Arizona. They're too stringent. They don't take into account the farming realities that we have in many of these basins that are most troubled. So.
Finally, one of Governor Doug Ducey's major water initiatives, called WIFA, the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, has effectively been cut off. WIFA was supposed to be the ones that were going to put together a deal on a desalination plant. Why did that happen, and what does it mean going forward?
Yeah, well, and I think that was the cart that got before the horse. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be just desalination. It was just, how do we find water to bring in additional water to the state? Because we know that we need that. We need to conserve what we have, but we also need additional water to get us where we need to go. And so that was really the goal. There was this promise 3 years ago that said, we're going to give you $1 billion, but we're going to split it over 3 years. And at that point, I was saying at the very beginning,
you called that.
Yeah, we're not going to get that money. And lo and behold, hey, guess what? We did not get the money.
What does it mean for desalination plants? Do those plans stop, on hold?
Well, that part is just not happening right now. They're really, the WIFA has worked on trying to put in place some policies to try to figure out how do we just get the water, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be desalination. It could be, but how do we just find the most water that gives us basically the biggest bang for our buck?
Wow, so a lot of work yet to be done.
Yes.
Joanna Allhands, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You can see all of our Sunday Square Off coverage on our YouTube channel. Go to 12news.com/YouTube.